Hello, welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the creators of Amy and Senna explore the rise and fall of Diego Maradona in their latest documentary. The film primarily focuses on when Argentinian football player Diego Maradona transfers from Barcelona to Naples, Italy to play for Napoli, one of the country's poorest areas and bottom of the league. Maradona transforms Napoli into a league-winning side, coinciding with his success and infamy in the 1986 World Cup, playing for Argentina, and is celebrated as one of the greatest players of all time. But Maradona's fame brings a heavy toll and an unprecedented fall from grace. Asif Kapadia is one of our great modern-day documentary filmmakers. His previous two movies, Senna and Amy, were compelling, comprehensive, and compassionate, and Diego Maradona is in much the same mould, although unlike those previous two outings, it doesn't cover someone whose life was tragically cut short at the peak of their powers. Quite the opposite, in fact. Maradona is notoriously divisive among football fans, especially regarding his private life. For this documentary, Kapadia followed up a lead regarding the existence of footage shot for a documentary in the mid-80s that was never completed. Maradona apparently controlled that footage, and Kapadia managed to convince him to use that footage in this project, so a lot of what you see is uniquely intimate and personal and has never been seen before. It's completely new insight. Now, I have to admit that I have a slight disadvantage when it comes to reviewing this movie because I'm not really a football fan. I'm one of those people that believes that sport is better played than actually watching it, but nevertheless, Maradona's story is extremely compelling. In fact, it works so well that honestly, I was engaged with it despite the fact that I don't really care for the sport, which only goes to show just how good of a film it is. The film primarily focuses upon Maradona's time in Naples. It covers some of the period before and after that in montages very rapidly that bookend the film, but otherwise it mostly spans this particular point in time, which I think is a wise decision for someone who's led us quite a storied life as Maradona has. I don't think you can entirely compact that into one film, and nevertheless this is perhaps the most important stretch of his life, and certainly the one with the most story to tell. At that particular moment, Maradona was coming off a time in Barcelona that was blighted by injury and also by disgrace, and when he arrives at Napoli, he's cheered on by the crowd, but he's also an extremely expensive signing for somewhere that struggles with borderline poverty in certain regards. You have to remember that in Italy there is this north-south economic divide, and I think that Maradona was very, very aware of that, and certainly he would have been playing for Napoli, where he was greeted by crowds for Juventus or the more affluent northern teams who jeer at him and the rest of his team with racist and classist taunts and chants. And I think that, to a certain extent, the film does argue that the reason that Maradona performed as well as he did during his time at Napoli is that because he genuinely connected with the people of Naples. His childhood was a very tough one. He grew up very poor in a shanty town, and around his teens, he started being the sole provider for his family. His football became not only his escape and his life and his talent, but also something that became his job. He was the one that was putting money on the table. And so there is that definite passion there, but also I think that what Napoli provided for him was a clear field. It left him a space for him to carve out his own legend, and that's exactly what you see in this film. As soon as Maradona is brought on board, his personality seems to raise the entire spirit of the team. He transforms it, almost single-handedly, seemingly, from being this losing, close to relegation side to becoming these winners. And certainly you can see the apex of Maradona's talent over the course of this documentary. One of the great things about the football footage is how excitingly it's depicted in the film. film. It's edited in a way that gets you involved with the action and makes you understand why Maradona was quite as adored as he was for his abilities, because watching it, you realise just how intelligent of a player he could be, and also it is genuinely thrilling to watch. And you can see that energy and propulsiveness all throughout this documentary, which is wonderfully paced right from the outset with that very earliest driving montage that establishes Maradona's life during this time as being like a roller coaster ride of accomplishment after accomplishment. We follow Maradona as he helps Napoli top their league, the first for a southern Italian side, but also helps shepherd Argentina to victory during the 1986 World Cup, somewhat notoriously, and seeing the people in the streets celebrating those victories, it's almost overwhelming. You can barely comprehend it, but you get a sense of just how important football was to the people of Argentina and Naples, and how Maradona's talent ascended him to being beyond merely simply being a player. He became a symbol in his own right. They revered him like a religious symbol. I really do mean that. They regard him like a demigod in some ways, and that's because he broke down barriers. He really was transformative in his own way. He empowered them, and in turn he claimed a lot of that for himself. But nevertheless, the sheer spectacle of people celebrating one man in this way is really quite astonishing and jaw-dropping to witness. But if Maradona did do a lot of good, he also did a lot of bad as well, and what becomes increasingly clear over the course of the documentary is there are two very distinct sides to him, and the way the interviewees describe it, it's almost like he's a Jekyll and Hyde style persona, because on the one hand you've got Diego, the loving, amicable person he could be, and on the other hand you've got Maradona, the public persona that he created because he has to be a representative for Naples. And they're almost described like they're two different people. At least one person says that I would go to the ends of the earth for Diego, but I wouldn't even put a step for Maradona. And over the course of the film, you witness him change as he becomes more and more successful. He becomes consumed by it. That persona becomes him instead of the person they actually was underneath that. And so this brash, very public persona just becomes incredibly toxic and all-consuming. Even people surrounding him saying, I didn't see Diego that I knew, I simply saw Maradona. Even before that point, though, his behaviour is certainly questionable when it comes to his private life. The film makes very clear that he was sleeping around with many other women while he was still engaged with a relationship with his girlfriend, who would later become his wife, and one of those affairs, he had a child, notoriously, that he refused to acknowledge for many, many decades, despite the fact that the parentage was well documented at the time. And so Maradona is not an entirely sympathetic figure over the course of the documentary, and certainly not in comparison to Ayrton Senna or Amy Winehouse, the previous focuses of Capadia's documentaries, but nevertheless, there is something very compelling about him, and sometimes that bad behaviour will bleed onto the pitch as well, not just in terms of Maradona's infamous temper, but also that notorious hand of God in the game against England in the 86 World Cup. And that incident is in the movie because of course it would have to be. It's the one thing that everyone knows about Maradona. But if I had a gripe against this film, I did think that the discussion of that felt oddly curtailed, especially because it's such a significant moment. Certainly I think that in England, we've never quite forgiven him. Even 30 years hence for that, it still felt in many quarters like he robbed that game from us. And maybe Capadia's thinking here is that because it's so well discussed, he didn't want to retread any of that ground here, but it just feels like it isn't really given that much significance in the narrative. It's also missing in that particular moment someone from England's POV in the interviewees, because most of the interviewees in the film are people that worked with Maradona during his time at Italy. It feels like an oversight. It's not a major flaw in the film, but it's definitely something that I felt as I was watching it. But nevertheless, that incident shows just how much of a sly and calculating player Maradona could be, and also how much of a cheat he could be if he thought he could get away with it. And certainly, I think that over the course of the film, you come to realise that Maradona is exceptionally talented, but he doesn't realise just how much success that brings with it. And that's what Pele says very early on in the film, and it becomes true. As he becomes more and more adored, he gets put on this pedestal that no one could possibly compare to, and certainly not someone as flawed as Maradona is. And when that becomes clear that he won't compare to the image that people have on him, they turn on him. The hatred for him really does become very intense, and it's partly Maradona's own fault for that. What the best documentaries try to do is they try to find a narrative in real life, which can often be difficult. It's not normally that tidy, but in Diego Maradona, Capadia finds this rise and fall tragedy that is as engaging as any drama and borders on stranger than fiction, and honestly, Maradona brings a lot of it down upon his head. You can see the seeds forming across the documentary as he becomes increasingly chummy with local organised crime, and also as his cocaine addiction mounts up, as the pressure starts to build upon him, and it becomes this open secret. Everyone at Napoli knows that he's knows that he's abusing the system, but no one wants to blow the whistle because he is the face of the club. And so the tension starts mounting. It becomes this ticking time bomb you know that is going to blow up in his face. And also his ego is building to the point where he thinks that he's not only untouchable, but it's isolating him as well. There's a great moment where we see Maradona at a party and he looks towards the camera and he's surrounded by all these people, and yet he looks like he's completely out of it in this environment. He looks so alien and so totally alone, and Capadia lingers and lingers and lingers. It's such a powerful moment. And then that behaviour starts to affect his relationship with his fans, which eventually mounts up at the '90 World Cup, where he's playing against Italy for his country, Argentina, in Naples. That is such a moment that if you were to write that into a fictional movie, a person like me would go, well, that's totally contrived. But that did actually happen. You can't believe that it did. I mean, why did no one think that that would not be a massive mess? But even so, that moment, that betrayal for the people of Italy and Naples just only goes to show how much that Maradona had built up this fame and was also the one that was also driving the wrecking ball. And the world is just collapsing around him, and you're watching all this enthralled by it. Capadia really makes it seem clear and also very, very poignant in its own way. Maradona is getting older over the course of the documentary. He needs to think about his own legacy, and the problem is, when you've accomplished everything that you could possibly do, where do you go from there? And the answer is, there is nowhere but downward. And so you do feel a certain amount of sympathy and pity for Maradona, even though he is responsible for a lot of what he's gone through, especially in the film's final moments. Diego Maradona is another brilliant documentary from Asif Kapadia. Whether you love or hate its central figure, there's no denying how well put together it is, especially in terms of wrangling all that footage together, and what you get is a portrait that is both honest and deeply personal about a man who is as polarising as he is celebrated, and you see both sides of that here. You can witness his genius while at the same time being critical about who he was off the pitch as well. And I think that it gets to the heart of a man who is very complicated, at times contradictory in the way that the best documentaries should do. Even if you're not a football fan, I still think that there is plenty to enjoy here, because what it emerges as is a fable about the pitfalls of fame. It's universal in that way. This is definitely one that goes right into the back of the net. Diego Maradona is one of the best football documentaries ever made, and one that will be compelling even to those who are not fans of the sport. What Asif Kapadia and his team create is a fascinating portrait of Maradona's talents and ability on the field that made him so revered, and his behaviour off of it that made him so reviled by those that once adored him. He becomes this Jekyll and Hyde-like figure through the narrative, and while this means he's a less sympathetic figure than Kapadia's previous focuses, you still feel for him as the architect of his own collapse. Moreover, his story emerges as this great tragedy that is wilder than fiction, as Maradona becomes victim to his own incredible fame and adulation and left with nowhere to go but to fall in dramatic fashion. The documentary takes one of the most controversial but brilliant sporting figures in recent memory and gets to the heart of the man at the centre of it. If you like this review, then kick your ball over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.